Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you've joined us for today's session, Governance Strategies for a Highly Effective Tribal Council. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, we have 2 great speakers with us today. We have Colleen Rozillis and Anita Shah, both partners here at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are in your webcast console. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Anita to get the presentation started.
Thank you, Amy. Colleen and I are super excited to be here today because governance strategies for a highly effective tribal council, it's an exciting topic for us because we work with tribal council and governing body members on a regular basis. And honestly, the biggest takeaway I hope you get from this is clearly outlining council's roles and responsibilities and having a master strategic plan to help with whether there are council changes, turnovers, so that you can continue to focus on the tribe's vision and objectives is what we would like for you to take away from here. We'll go over these agenda topics: introduction to good governance, habits of effective tribal council, the different types of effective finance, investment, and audit committees you can have, and then tips for effective meetings in this new, mostly in person, but slightly still hybrid environment we live in. Over the last 16 years of working with tribal governments and organizations, I've seen a lot of council changes occur, a lot of turnover. And what happens, the biggest thing that happens is there is slowdown in progress that tribes are making in their organizations when there is significant amount of turnover. So we'll be going over practical ways you can prevent that. You can continue to focus on the tribe's objectives and values while dealing with that turnover. So with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Amy to go over our first polling question.
All right, thank you. So the first polling question is, what is your role in your tribal organization? And your options are A, council member, B, committee member, C, tribal administrator, executive director, D, management, E, staff, or F, other, not applicable. And the polling questions are located right on the slides that we're presenting. If you can't see it, you can hit the F5 key to refresh your console. And then to respond, please click the button next to the answer you choose and make sure to hit that submit button. All right, we'll leave this up for another 5 seconds so everyone can get their responses in. And here are the results.
All right, thank you, Amy, and thanks, everyone. It looks like we have a good spread between folks who are involved in governance and folks who support those in governance. So we hope that this webcast will address kind of from both ends what we can do to help the council staff partnership and also what we can do to be better council or board members. One thing that Anita and I wanted to note right at the beginning of this webcast is tribal governments often have different definitions of your governing body. You might have a Congress, you might have a tribal council, you might have a board. For the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to use tribal council, but that would apply to any kind of top-level governing group within a tribal government. And it should apply to committees, commissions, kind of sub-boards, things like that as well, because the principles of good governance are basically the same. Governance at a very basic level is a combination of what we do to support leadership within an organization. So the governing body really uses the framework of governance, the policies we have in place, as well as the behaviors of the governing body to ensure that leadership is making good decisions and is ultimately delivering on your tribal government's mission, both effectively and accountably. When we think about a governance model, really a tribal council at a basic level has 4 responsibilities. We're establishing the organization's mission, vision, and strategy, really defining what our place is within our tribal community, setting the direction of the organization. So thinking about what are the goals we want to achieve, what are the metrics that we want to look at for organizational performance, and then accountability. So that is both looking at how management is delivering on the strategic plan, monitoring against the strategic plan and the goals that the tribal council has set, and also the behavior and performance of fellow board members. This also is where the performance of the tribal executive director, general manager, CEO would come in. And then we have a really important piece that sometimes gets forgotten, especially when we are in an elected realm where sometimes folks run for activist reasons, which is a great reason to run for government, but it also can provide some tension in terms of then having to be in a leadership role, and that's goodwill and support. So there's a couple of pieces there. We're representatives of tribal government to the community and to external parties, and then we want to provide support and counsel to leadership in the organization and staff. Fundamentally, if you are part of tribal council, then you want to help to position the reputation of tribal government within your community to ultimately support the mission of tribal government. We always have a little bit of a challenge with tribal councils and other boards that we work with where it's hard to stay kind of in that sweet spot. Some tribal councils will be up too high. You know, they'll be, sometimes we might hear something like a rubber stamp board, right? We're just there to kind of look at things very high level and don't necessarily ask too many questions and do everything that management recommends. And then on the other hand, we can have tribal councils that are way too in the weeds, looking very operationally in the details, micromanaging staff, wanting to get in there and actually do the work. And that can be a really difficult position for staff to figure out how to manage. And I think probably the best example that I have is I have a former client where they had a member of their council who actually would request every single credit card statement every month from across the government because they wanted to read what folks were purchasing. And that is not a control that we actually want to have in place, and it's not the highest and best use of someone who is an elected official. What we really want is folks to be doing that big picture strategic thinking kind of right in the middle there. And this table really shows what that looks like. And ultimately, it's your tribal council is deciding, what are we going to do? What is our mission? What are our goals? And then we delegate to staff, how are we actually going to do that? I think the budget is a really good example of that tribal council is involved in really reviewing the budget, making sure it's aligned with strategic goals, making sure that the policy that we want is reflected there, but it's management that formulates that budget. And we're not going to get in there as board members and do that kind of line by line thing. Same thing in terms of kind of planning and programming. We might be involved in very specific areas, maybe a subcommittee, things like that, where we might be able to get our hands into planning, maybe things like comprehensive planning, land management, things like that. But it's ultimately management's job to implement those plans. And it's really important to honor that differentiation between the what and the how, so that then it's easier for council to look at accountability and to really be able to say, how are we performing, and take that kind of big picture, long view. Probably the most important thing that a tribal council can do is approve a strategic plan and make sure that the strategic plan is updated. We don't want strategic plans to sit on a shelf. We don't want to be using a plan from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we had no idea that we were going to go into a global pandemic, right? So if we've got an old strategic plan, it might be totally irrelevant based on kind of what's happening with our communities, as well as things like federal funding. The plan development itself is a collaboration between council and management. We really want council focused at that mission, vision, high-level goals area. And then the operational things, the how we're going to get there, that's what staff really does. And then over time, the plan is implemented by management with oversight provided by council. Anita, you have worked with, I'm going to guess, dozens, maybe hundreds of tribal councils and tribal governments. Are there any lessons learned about strategic planning that you want to share?
I think the number one thing is to keep that updated. Whenever, that doesn't mean that when you change over when you have elections and there's a new council coming in, that doesn't necessarily mean you update that strategic plan, but it is good to revisit it every 5 years to evaluate whether that still applies to your values as your organization, if your membership or your citizens are still happy with that, if that still applies to your entire community. So revisiting that on a regular basis is important. Moving on to tribal council's fiduciary responsibilities. So when you are elected as a council member, or you're appointed as a board member, you are responsible to your tribal citizens and members. You're responsible to safeguard the tribe's assets and your enterprises. Some of the duties may include formally approving larger transactions and initiatives, your annual budget, overseeing the entire organization's risk management, ensuring that you're evaluating what risk tolerance level you want to be at, and ensuring an overall system of good internal controls. This fiduciary responsibility also applies to your enterprise board. We also highly recommend having council representation on your enterprise boards, whether that's a non-voting representation or a voting member, just to make sure council has proper oversight over the boards, over those different enterprises, but then also to ensure, like Colleen mentioned, you don't get too into the weeds of operating, being that governing body for that board, for that separate enterprise, but you have just the right level of involvement. So to provide more clarity on that fiduciary responsibility, when you're appointed or you're elected in that role, basically your citizens, your tribal members or tribal citizens are telling you that we're giving you this trust, and what we expect from you is a high level of competence and judgment in your role, that you will be putting the organization first and avoiding conflicts of interest, and that basically you are going to be keeping the tribe on course to achieve the progress the tribe has planned, or the goals that you've set out in your strategic plan. How you do that is by being informed, asking questions. Just because we elect our officials, that doesn't, tribal citizens, tribal members don't necessarily always expect council members to have all the answers, but also be asking to stay informed, stay updated on things, stay objective, being responsible. One big thing is to ask for help when you need it, whether that's internal or external, making sure that you're ultimately there to do what's best for the tribe. The last bullet there, investigating irregularities. If you're seeing something that seems unusual or someone's cutting corners, that could be a slippery site. So please do investigate that too. It's that TSA motto of if you see something, you say something. In your case, that's something that you would need to investigate because you are that governing body. So that is take on the fiduciary responsibility, takes on a higher level of expectations for you and higher involvement from you. Here are a list of council policies that you must have. Those are on the left side. Those are conflict of interest. We see most organizations have these conflict of interest policies. Gift acceptance keeps your council members and board governing body members honest and responsible. Joint venture policy, or if you're making an investment as a tribal government, if you're making an investment or entering into a partnership, ensuring that you're considering the risks of the organization. Whistleblower policy keeps basically having more of an open door policy, keeping your employees, telling them in an indirect way that it is safe for them to share information, share unusual information or suspicions of fraud or known fraud with you all without any repercussions. And the document retention and destruction policy is super important for future council and future management folks and their external requirements as well, for that to ensure that there is documentation of how you came up with your decision. And then there are 10 policies on the right that I won't go into every policy on, but these are good to have. If you're a newer council member, or if you're a council member that's been around for a long time, take a look at your policies and make sure that these have been updated on a regular basis. Like Colleen mentioned, none of us were expecting the pandemic, and that could have changed your current practices. So ensuring your policies are updated with the current environment is important. Here is a breakdown of organizational policies overall. So there, on the left side, there's a council-related policies, and then there are personnel policies, and then financial policies. Council-related policies, again, I won't go into every one of these. You do have copies of these slides. Basically, what you want to do is make sure that these policies are updated and they are in line with what your strategic plan or your vision or objectives are as a tribal government or tribal organization. Your code of conduct policy is not something I've seen on a regular basis, but I've seen very strong policies at various tribal governments on this. Basically, it lays out what tribal council's expectations are and what your guiding principles are as your workplace for an appropriate workplace behavior. And what that does, having this policy in place, also helps communicating this with your tribal citizens and members, letting them know that you have these policies is also important as a good faith gesture as well, for them to know that you have these policies in place and that you are abiding by them. Another policy that is required for if you're an organization that receives federal funding, you're required to have a conflict of interest policy, but it is a very important policy to have regardless of the federal funding component, because what this tells you is that what this tells people that work with the tribal government or the tribal organization, and this tells your members and your citizens, is that you're keeping yourself responsible. I will tell you that almost every tribal government I work with has a conflict of interest policy, but what doesn't happen on a regular basis is on an annual basis, we recommend that board members or council members should disclose what their material interests are in different organizations to make sure that that is out in the open and that is evaluated. So if there is a potential conflict of interest with an organization, that those council members or board members are not involved in making a decision related to that. So updating that list of your material interests is going to make this conflict of interest policy more effective. So we're on to another polling question.
All right, thank you. So the second polling question is, how comprehensive are your council policies and procedures? And then your options are A, our policies are complete and up to date. B, we have some policy gaps. C, our policies need a full update. Or D, I don't know. And I also want to take this time to remind you, you have the option to submit questions for the presenters in the Q&A window. We do have quite a bit of content to cover today, so if we don't have time to respond during the webcast, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. All right, and here are the results.
Well, this is about what we normally see with our clients. It's, a small number of folks have complete and up-to-date policies, and there's always the opportunity to address some gaps and update things. But we like to see our policies that are updated, every 2 to 3 years is a good window. Realistically, it can be more like 5 years, but things change really fast in the environment, particularly with federal funding, with employment regulations and policies and things like that. So it's important to do that regular overview of policies. Without a policy in place, you can't hold people accountable, and that's a place then where people like us get called in for things. So I'm going to talk about how tribal councils can be effective and kind of what those behaviors are, and a lot about the council staff partnership. There are a number of governance habits really listed on this slide. I talked a lot in the first section around how to be strategic and the importance of strategy and a strategy mindset when we have elected officials. One thing that can be really challenging is to stay in that strategic mindset. And so learning about external forces that are potentially risks or opportunities for the tribal government and our enterprises, really spending time practicing continuous personal learning is a great way to stay in that strategic mindset. We also have the importance of really understanding what teamwork looks like and then demonstrating it. A tribal council really sets the tone for the rest of the organization, and folks are watching every move that we make. And so it's really important to know what our team needs to be successful and to really demonstrate that and show that publicly. Honoring the council staff partnership is really critical. Again, going back to that, the council decides what, staff decides how, and really supporting the executive is very important. Then we think about things like having appropriate rules and procedures for meetings. So knowing that our bylaws are up to date, that we have procedures. A lot of governing bodies are starting to adopt not necessarily a code of conduct, but things like group norms, right? So we will make sure that we allow everyone to participate equally. We'll come to meetings prepared. We'll be collaborative, things like that. We're seeing a lot more of that, and that can really change how folks operate because it gives you the ability to maybe call folks in or have easier conversations if you feel like people are not necessarily behaving in the way that you want. And, human nature will sometimes overtake, especially if we're having kind of difficult decisions that we have to make. I also want to put in a really big plug for regularly evaluating performance. The best governing bodies do an annual self-assessment. That can be really, really easy to do. You can do an anonymous survey, just use SurveyMonkey. If you have a governance committee or an executive committee, they can lead that process. Sometimes it's helpful when you do that work to actually engage a facilitator. I have done quite a bit of that in terms of if you think a conversation might be difficult or if we think we might need to change our behavior, then having someone as a third party do that initial survey or potentially even some interviews, and then coming back to the tribal council and having a conversation about, okay, here's our results. What do we want to do about that? I also want to really highlight last the idea of shared constituency. So folks get elected or appointed to a tribal council, a committee, something like that. And we obviously all have our personal interests and the reason why we all ran for office or wanted to be on the tribal council. And those personal priorities are very important when we think about, okay, what does our strategic plan look like? What's the legacy that I want to leave? What are our long-term goals and objectives? But we also want to always ground ourselves in thinking about representative leadership. We're here to represent all of our tribal citizens, all of our membership, potentially thinking about our kind of surrounding community, our employees, things like that, and understanding what our stakeholders need and putting that first before our own personal interests. That's always a push and pull with every governing body, but I think it's a really important grounding reminder. And some organizations, I see that actually in their group norms, and it can be very powerful. The culture of any tribal council is driven by both formal elements, things like what is our form of governance, do we use Robert's Rules of Order, what sorts of committees do we have, and how do they give information to us, the policies that we have in place, what our procedures are, and our nominating practices, our onboarding practices, how do we elect folks, how do we put folks on these governing bodies, and what does that look like, then how do we onboard them. But there's a lot that happens that's actually not documented, that can be hard to document and can change over time depending on who's on our tribal council. The nature of an elected or an appointed governing body is that we're going to constantly have people changing, and we're going to make sure that we have we want to hold on to the good parts of our culture, right? So things like, what are the relationships between those individual council members? What do we bring in from maybe our prior personal relationships with these folks that we might need to either highlight or set aside, knowing that we're in a professional governing environment? What relationships are between council and staff, and how engaged folks are. So again, are we in the weeds? Are we up too high? That can really define the whole culture of a tribal council. How we communicate. So are we more informal? Are we more kind of friendly and kind of personal when we communicate? Are we very formal? Do we speak? Do we really use Robert's Rules to it's financed and we speak through the chair, for example? And also the expectations of the chair, of the head of the tribe. What are the expectations that we have for one another, and what does that look like? Another piece of this that's really important is, how do we share information with folks? Who's responsible for that? How do we communicate in between meetings, and how is information given in between council members and staff throughout the course of the year? Some folks have that actually formally documented. Some organizations, especially kind of the larger they are, it's nice to have a communication framework delivered. But in a lot of cases, we run into someone, we're getting coffee, and then we start chatting, and where does that information go? And does everyone have everything they need in order to make strong decisions? That's really important to think about. It can make or break your culture. And then finally, how much we trust each other. Can we be candid together? Can we work together in a way where we feel really comfortable being in the room and being able to walk away and knowing that information that's discussed in executive session or with confidentiality isn't moved out? And how do we manage our conflict together? And how do we get through difficult decisions? Because not everything is going to be designed by consensus. The council staff partnership is based on 4 very important principles. So things that I mentioned on the last slide, things like trust, respect, be candid with folks, communicating a lot. I mean, ultimately what we want is no surprises in this relationship. We want to make sure that at a minimum, your executive or general manager, tribal administrator is meeting regularly with your tribal council chair, maybe with the executive committee or governance committee as well, to make sure that we have all of the information that we need, kind of sharing. Strategic thinking, I think we're probably saying that quite a bit today, but it is very critical that both sides approach strategically. We need to make short-term decisions all the time, but long-term decisions are going to be really important for us and for those kind of future tribal councils. really clear expectations for the leadership of your organization is very important. So a lot of times what we'll see is if we don't have a strategic plan in place or we have tribal councils that turn over frequently, the general manager acts with a real lack of expectation. And then they can be stuck in a place of, well, you didn't do what we wanted you to do, but that wasn't ever clearly defined, or maybe that was the prior council's priority, and that can really cause a lot of tension in that relationship. And then having regular performance evaluations. I would say that the majority of my clients, if they're a high-functioning organization, they actually will neglect that annual performance evaluation of the general manager or tribal administrator, which can be really difficult. We don't hold people accountable because we might not want to have difficult conversations. But then on the other hand, we don't have the ability to reward and recognize folks, as well as giving them a sense of how well are we doing and really providing that important feedback for going into the next year. So I think if you are in a situation where we're not having a regular performance review of the executive, really take a moment to think about how you want to do that and put that into a policy so that we actually do that. In any group, we need to understand and continually reinforce decision-making capacity. In a tribal council, we're making decisions all the time that impact our community on a daily basis and can leave a really long-term, it can be decades of impact. And so we need to understand for every group, and again, with an elected group, we've got folks who transition in and out all the time. So this is always changing. We need to understand who are we as a tribal council, what are our goals, what's our core identity, what are our core values. We need to understand for every single person what kind of information do they need to be able to make a decision. Do they need a lot of data up front? Do we need to give them information 2 weeks in advance versus a couple of days in advance? Are there folks that are at a higher level and so they just want to know, okay, give me the so what, and I don't need the detailed information? It's important to understand for every member of your tribal council, how do they exercise their influence? So are they folks who speak up a lot in the room during the meeting, or are they folks who have those conversations in between meetings? And how do we want to manage that? And the same thing for their conflict style. Are folks more passive? Are folks more direct? That's going to really help, particularly for the chair of your tribal council. It's going to really help you to understand how you need to speak to people individually, and are there ways that we can have conversations that maybe can be more productive, understanding that we might have folks who have differing conflict styles. And then finally, everyone comes with their individual concerns and priorities. It's very important for folks in that chair and vice chair role to know what priorities folks have when they ran for office, when they came into their seat, and how things are progressing with their priorities and if they have changed, because that all is going to feed in to how we make those long-term decisions. Lots and lots of tribal councils have strong onboarding programs with, I have lots of clients where it's a big binder of every budget, every piece of information that you might need to understand every tribal government department or division. What we often don't do is provide that ongoing education. So when we're onboarding folks, I think it's always useful to invite seated council members to those onboarding meetings. They don't have to come, but even if you've served a long time, things change, right? Your org chart changes, your financials change, your budget changes. And so having that regular update can be really valuable, and it can help to build those relationships for our new council members. We also really recommend having an apprenticeship or buddy program. So if you're a new council member, pairing someone up with a more experienced council member as an official buddy, someone you can ask questions to, how you can really relate to the decision-making process and the culture of the tribal council, that can be very valuable to maintain and build up your culture. And then if you have the ability to have apprenticeships, so if there are folks who are younger, who are interested in serving in tribal government, having them starting to serve on committees, being paired up with a current council member and starting to understand that work can build a really strong pipeline to public service, and that can be very valuable. And then what we like to see on a regular basis is that tribal council members and your core committees are trained. I would say all of these topics you could probably cover over a 2 to 3 year period. Things like good governance principles, fiduciary responsibility, getting a regular training from your financial statement auditors can be really valuable on things like the single audit and requirements that tribes are subject to, so that you really understand what your fiduciary responsibility is. Risk management is also really important. Ultimately, that's the other side of strategy, right? What do we want to achieve and how do we mitigate risks? And then a couple of other principles. So ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance. Essentially, what's our impact on our community? Tribal governments are starting to look into ESG reporting of things, KPIs like climate impact, and we're seeing that bubble up. And then diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what are our values? What do we want to promote for our organization? Who are we as an employer? Who are we in the community? And really having a tribal government establish those values, and then having the council understand what that means for us and how that impacts our decision-making going forward. All right, Amy, we've got another poll.
All right, so the third polling question is, when was your last council retreat? And your options are in 2023, in the past 2 years, before the pandemic, or we've never had one. And then as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions.
I'll be curious about the responses in this section because we're seeing a lot of council retreats happening in the past year and a half.
All right, here are the results.
Well, that's just about right on, although I see a big chunk of folks who've never had one. This is an area where we can make a big difference as staff. So I know there are a lot of folks who are management, tribal government staff on. Encouraging tribal council to have a council retreat, to spend time thinking about strategy and thinking about their culture and setting that up for them can be a really great way to move initiatives forward and to really get aligned, particularly as we get to the end of the calendar year. Thinking about scheduling this sometime in the spring could be really valuable for your organization. And you can do it on your own, or you can have it facilitated. Either way, I think they're very valuable for organizations. Okay, Anita, over to you.
Thanks, Colleen. So being a CPA, there's a little bit of a focus that I want to do on finance-related topics. Council members should be aware of these 3 core committees that you really, really should have in your organization. Starting out with the Finance Committee, and establishing the framework of the committee, establishing a charter, goals, selecting committee members from various different cross-sections of your organization, and then selecting the cadence of your meetings to make sure you're not inundating people with meetings, but also having enough meetings to support your primary responsibilities. For a finance committee, those responsibilities entail overseeing your budget, tracking your budgets from budget to actual, approving any significant monetary policies, ensuring that your financial systems and supporting systems are following your current practices and accepted standards, that you have strong oversight, the Finance Committee has strong oversight over protecting your tribal government organization's reputation. I always tell council members that finance is the backbone of any organization. Having Finance Committee overseeing the operations of the finance department and finances overall of the organization is super important. And then evaluating your committees on a regular basis, evaluating the performance of the individual committee members, but also of the committee if they are accomplishing the goals that you set out for the committee. Performing an analysis to see if there are any changes that need to be made to whether the individual is responsible, to their responsibilities, or to the policies. And then establishing a committee pipeline. I want to say there's only one tribal government that I've seen do this very successfully in terms of having an apprenticeship for tribal youth to basically shadow your finance committee or audit or investment committee, really any significant committee that you have in the organization. Involve tribal youth in it. Just have them shadow it, have them understand how your government is operating and really what the work entails. I think you can create incentives for them to attend those committee meetings, but it just gives tribal youth so much more exposure to the operations of the government. So doing this for every committee, not just for the finance committee, would be really helpful for your tribal youth. The finance committee should also oversee the financial statements. When auditors issue financial statements, review those financial statements. If you are an organization that receives federal funds, look at what your unspent grant funds are. Make sure that those grant funds have plans on how to appropriately use that funding within the prescribed timeline. Having an investment committee, again, the framework is similar to the finance committee, establishing a charter, selecting proper committee members, and a cadence to the meetings. But having an investment committee really helps you protect your organization's investments. The stock markets, there's a lot of emotions involved in the ups and downs of the stock market, and having a policy in place for your organization would basically take emotion out of that and really focus on the risk tolerance and risk level that your organization has decided, and to basically follow that, to adhere to the risks that you're willing to tolerate. Monitor and evaluate your investment advisors and custodians. Approving the custody of investment authorities. These are things that an investment committee can do. And then I do recommend having a council member or an appointed member involved in these committees, so you can go back or have some way to report back to the council on how the committees are operating, evaluating them, again, evaluating their responsibilities, their goals, the individuals in the committee, and then again having a committee pipeline. An audit committee is something that I don't. Regular finance and investment committees are committees I have seen more often at tribal governments, but I don't unfortunately see audit committees as often. And really, it's such an important factor for not just overseeing your internal audit department, but also your external auditors. Evaluating and selecting auditors, evaluating the scope of what the audit should entail, whether that's an external audit or an internal audit function. Reviewing recommendations from auditors, seeing how they're being applicable, how they're being applied at the organization. Overall, the audit committee provides you the strength of having a stronger, or basically it helps you provide a stronger control environment over your organization. With this, I would also say unfortunately haven't seen a lot of successful internal audit departments. The ones that I have a few tribes that do have a very successful internal audit department. Those should be created in conjunction with, the internal audit plan should be created in conjunction with approval from the full council, so that there is proper coordination amongst council approval of what internal audit should be looking at. So it's not just, one council member saying what the internal audit should look at. It's a full council decision. And I think having that internal audit department will help you create stronger checks and balances within your own organization. So now I have these 8 best practices for tribes, and for those, I know most of you all on the call are management and staff, and that's great because these 8 best practices are really operational matters, and they should be the duty of management. But I want governing body members, council members, to be aware of this because they should be aware of these best practices and that these best practices are documented in policies to, again, reduce the risk when you have turnover, reduce the risk of uncertainty and progress that the tribe is making. So tone at the top, it is the number one thing that sets the culture of the culture of communication within the organization, ensuring that management and council have an open door policy and encouraging people and encouraging them and proactively communicate on ethical behavior is there's a strong point, a strong best practice for a tribe or really any organization. Segregation of duties is another one that you want to make sure that you've got that segregation of duties to ensure you have good checks and balances and there are internal controls in place that reduces your risk of fraud, the risk of abuse, and really risk of human error. I mentioned the whistleblower policy earlier, having a hotline so that employees have a venue to share information that they're not sure about, or if they don't want to be involved in, they can anonymously share that information with you. With whether this information goes to your tribal administrator or equivalent or certain members from council, it's important to have this kind of venue for employees. Point 5 are really rotation of personnel and mandatory vacation. So these go hand in hand because there are often times when we see that fraud has occurred because of from an employee that has always there, never takes vacation, super helpful, single-handedly takes care of everything. What that does is not only preventing you from training other people to do these duties, but also it's also significant risk of fraud if one person is doing everything and they're not, there's not proper oversight over certain areas. So having mandatory vacations, having rotating personnel will really help you reduce your risk of fraud and to help cross-train when you have turnover. Reconciliation review process, again, being an auditor, for reconciliation and review process over their accounting records. We report a lot of audit findings on this, unfortunately, and more so what happened during the pandemic, and that was probably unusual because of the circumstances we were in. But having timely reconciliations and reviews, not only the audit findings, eliminating audit findings is always a good thing, but really it helps protect the tribal government from fraud and abuse of really any tribal organization. Setting of accounting system privileges, and actually 7 and 8 kind of go hand in hand too, reviewing and adjusting access levels. So your accounting system you have so much ability to do things in there, but there is a significant risk if you have 1 or 2 people that can do a lot of things in the accounting system. So ensuring that you have set of proper privileges, that each person only has access to what they need to have access to is very important. For example, payroll employees do not need, those employees processing payroll, they do not need to be have access to AP or vendor payments. Accounts receivable, people taking care of accounts receivable don't need access to HR employee records. Having your top finance person and IT involved in at least on an annual basis reviewing access level and within who has access to what in the accounting system is also a very good best practice. Moving on to the next polling question.
All right, thank you. So the last polling question is, does your tribal council have a finance, investment, and/or an audit committee? And your options are A, we have a finance, investment, and audit committee. B, we have one or a couple of these committees. C, we don't have any of the 3 committees, but are considering them. Or D, I'm not sure. And while you're responding, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them now from the console. We will also be sending them out via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. All right, we'll leave this up another 5 seconds or so. Make sure you hit the submit button so that it records your responses. And here are the results.
And those look about evenly split, which reflects a lot of what Anita was saying. So thank you all for engaging in our polls for CPE. Our last section is to talk a little bit about how to have an effective meeting. I think this is a great place for staff and the tribal council, particularly the chair, or if you have a governance committee, to really work on how do we have the best meetings that we possibly can. Some of this stuff might seem a little bit simple, but honestly, there are a lot of governing bodies that miss some of these things. So things like setting your agenda far enough in advance, making sure that the objectives of the meeting are clear. What are we trying to accomplish today? Some tribal councils that I see have on a detailed agenda things like how much time do we think we should spend on this item? Are there materials that we have sent in advance and providing links to those materials in advance? I think that's really important. Starting and ending on time. So explaining to your council members that it's really important to end a meeting on time can be challenging because we obviously want to talk about things as much as they need to be talked about, but it's also about really the value of folks' time. So can we be productive in a meeting? Can we make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate without having meetings that end up going, sort of late into the night, kind of things like that? Really showing that we respect and value time and want to make decisions in a productive manner. Also sets the tone for management, and it can be very valuable and useful for management because we always have lots of staff who sit in on the meetings as well to provide information. Making sure that folks participate and communicate in an effective way. Every group is going to have folks who talk more and folks who talk less. And so having the chair understand that, making sure to call on folks who are quieter to see if they have any input into a decision or want to make comments, have questions. But also for those of us, myself included, who are, sort of the first to raise our hands and want to participate a lot, really making sure that we take a step back and that we're not always the first person to speak up or we're not dominating the conversation. That's something that a lot of folks, particularly elected officials, is something we all have to work on a little bit because we're there for a reason and absolutely there from a passionate perspective. Establishing a mission moment in a meeting can be really valuable. So thinking about taking a moment to hear from a tribal member, someone who has been impacted by a program or service offered by the tribal government can be really valuable in the meeting to remind folks why we're here, right? We're here to serve our citizens. We're here to improve their quality of life. And so hearing from folks maybe who have been through a workforce development program, folks who are participating in education, maybe folks who are involved in things like sustainability, land management, that can be a really valuable use of time. Establishing meeting agreements, I'll talk about that a little bit more. I mentioned it before, but just thinking about how we want to behave toward each other is important. How we use technology also, so things like online collaboration platforms, ways that we can have remote attendees to our meetings now that we're in 2023 and we're sort of past having all Zoom meetings, what that could look like. Having folks understand your roles and responsibilities. So very clearly, what is the role of the chair? What are the roles of committee chairs? What's the role of each member on tribal council? And what's the role of staff during these meetings? Having that documented can be really valuable for making your meetings go well. Making sure that we also follow up. So this is not just about accountability toward staff, as we mentioned right up at the top, it's also accountability toward each other. So at the end of every meeting, we recommend things like looking at what our key decision items are, what are our action items, making sure folks have clear understanding of who's responsible for them and when we want them to be complete, and then make sure that we follow up, so put them on the next agenda or a future agenda where it's appropriate. Evaluating your effectiveness. So I mentioned kind of that regular annual self-assessment. You can say at the end of a meeting, once a month, how do we do? Are there opportunities that we could improve our process? Are there things that we need to address? And then finally, making sure that we maintain confidentiality. This can be a little bit challenging for folks, when we have kind of big issues, particularly in tribal government when folks might impact us personally, decisions might impact us personally. And so making sure that you have that commitment to one another to have things that are sensitive, things that are done in executive session absolutely remain confidential, and holding folks accountable to that as well. A set of meeting agreements that we recommend, and you can add a lot more to this for whatever fits with your tribal council. So thinking about those norms, we want folks to be engaged in the meeting, try not to multitask. I think sort of the most challenging part of being in our current governing body is that you will be in a meeting, folks might be watching, and they might be texting you during it, right? So really thinking about how we can limit that multitasking, staying on topic, and to stay on topic, maybe we'll have a parking lot for additional issues. Thinking about things like assuming positive intent when folks are talking, not trying to take things personally, and also respecting the decision of the majority. So if not every decision is a consensus decision, then how do we walk away from that, shake hands, understand I might have been in the minority there, but I'm in a leadership role, I'm moving forward in a positive way because this is an important decision for our tribe. And then when you establish those meeting agreements, asking the group, is there anything else that's going to work for us today? So I was in a meeting yesterday where we asked that question, and a member of the group said, I think this meeting's going to be really difficult, and so what we'd like to do is every hour take at least a 5-minute break so that we can have a brain break. And everybody agreed to that, and that was a really great one-time meeting agreement. And then finally, if we've got hybrid meetings, I would say probably half of the tribes that I work with have gone back to full-time in person, and the other half are doing hybrid participation, at a minimum letting folks participate and give presentations remotely, which can be really helpful for staff. So just a couple things to think about here. Make sure you test that technology in advance. Your Meeting Owl, your AV system that has worked every single time might not work today. And so making sure that we test it in advance, and also have someone on the other side who can see what it looks like from a remote perspective to be able to think about how do we want to position our cameras, how do we want to make sure that we involve folks and so they can hear us. There's a lot of big meeting rooms where you kind of see a large table and folks around the table, but when you're participating virtually, it can be hard to actually see who's talking. That can be challenging. I also cannot recommend enough for folks who are in the room in person to limit side talk. Microphones pick up everything. It can be really hard to hear if you're participating virtually, actually what's going on if folks are talking on the side. And in general, side talk, whether your meeting's all in person or hybrid, it can create a little bit of a challenge for everyone in the room if we're having side talk. Using breakout rooms for folks who are virtual so that they can talk to each other can be valuable. Also making sure, again, that intentional participation, call on folks who are hybrid, especially if they've got their cameras off, right? We still want them to participate fully, and so making sure to call on folks. And sometimes that means that we want to use a facilitator for some important hybrid meetings. I've certainly been a part of quite a few of those, both as a participant and as a facilitator. And then really thinking about technology, not just for folks who are online, but for folks in the room. So using something like Menti or a polling system, using Google Jamboards or other digital collaboration tools that everyone around the table can use can be really valuable for having folks feel very comfortable and feel like they got a lot out of participating, even if it was hybrid. So we don't have time for questions today. We will follow up with folks individually if you submitted a question. And if you'd like to submit a question to us individually, here's our contact information. And I'm going to hand it over to Amy to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you, Colleen, and thank you, Anita, for a great presentation today. And to our audience, if you do have further questions or comments, please reach out to us, and we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window now or reach out to Anita and Colleen directly. Their contact information is in your console as well as in the slide deck. And then we invite you to visit our website for more resources and information on this topic, many of which are linked in your handouts window in your console. And then if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks as well. And then finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. And again, thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone.